Thanks, everybody. This is our first IEN event, and the format is wonderful. Love the facilitation, the ability to engage new, groups and members in conversation, the structure. So really appreciate that. We're going to hear from a veteran impact investment institution, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. I'm Mike Hokenson with CIM. We're a sponsor for today. We are an impact investment manager, part of the growing set of US-centric managers that pursues market rate and impact objectives. For us, it's about designing and scaling a responsible digital financial industry and reaching underserved borrowers and supporting the impact economy, which we quantify in a number of ways, and are pleased to have New Hampshire as a client, as well as a number of endowments on the foundation side. Universities are new to us, so it's great to hear that perspective today. And Michael, do you want to say a word on, actually, I guess they have the intro. So we can just launch directly into questions, because you've got some backgrounds in your booklet there. So Michael, can you briefly describe the history of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation with impact investing, and in particular, what developments led to the creation of the Impact Investment Fund?
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. And just a quick background in terms of our history. Formed in 1962, we manage about $750 million in assets. Our history, I'm not the veteran on impact investing, as Mike said, the institution is. We first started making impact investments in 1971. And if you look at a very high level in terms of what's motivated us to do this kind of work, I think from an investment perspective, if you step back and say every time you look at an investment, either as an individual or as an institution, you say either what is my return or what is the institution's return. And using impact investing as a way to turn that question around a little bit and say, what is our return from a community perspective? So can the invested assets not only generate an investment return, but can we help a family avoid foreclosure? Can we help a business that seeks or needs capital, that's struggling in a non-bankable, non-traditional kind of way to access capital, or a non-profit that's trying to get going with a capital project, their donor commitments have not yet come in, so they need bridge financing? Can we help in some way to look at the investments holistically and say, what is our return for those investments? So that's at a high level how we've thought about and approached this work. If you break it then down further into who's encouraged us to do more, and we launched our Impact Investment Fund as a separate investment option in 2016. The drivers there, beyond the traditional work we'd done on impact investing, going back to 1971, was board encouragement, and also as a community foundation where we received donations from generous local individuals, families, and businesses. We also had donors encouraging us to do so. And as you heard earlier, this idea of the younger generations nudging institutions, that's something we also saw in terms of encouraging us. And then finally, I commented on nonprofits. Why do this? Another area is that there are times that nonprofits need capital. Part of what we are about is providing grant scholarship funding to individuals and nonprofits, but also there are other types of capital they may need where there's an investment return associated with it.
And we heard from many of the initial comments about structures and how an impact vehicle may or may not relate to the broader endowment. So can you share with us a little bit on the mechanics of the Impact Investment Fund, and how does that vehicle relate to the broader endowment of New Hampshire?
So time will tell whether this is a clever idea. I think we're all learning as we do this work. Some community foundations have a dedicated carve-out within their endowment. Some community foundations allow donors to invest alongside the community foundation, so they go direct. What we chose to do is the direct side's challenging from an administrative perspective, trying to manage many individual deals. So we created a fund structure, a portfolio, but the portfolio is capitalized with donor-advised funds making allocations from the donor-advised fund, theoretically up to the entirety of the donor-advised fund. So giving donors a way to express their, so to speak, their investment interests, sort of aligning them if they so wish on the impact side. And then the foundation board also agreed to commit a percentage of the endowment and allocate that into the pool so that we have collectively a pool of capital that we can then invest for community investment purposes.
So interest from different stakeholders, the mechanics of setup are two aspects. And what about pipeline and allocation? So how has it been your experience in developing a pipeline, evaluating those opportunities, and were there specific partnerships or additional resources needed to do that, which might be relevant to the steps where some of our members are today?
Good. So one of the cautions we gave to our board early on when looking for approval for this approach is we weren't sure there would be enough deal flow. So how are we going to source investment ideas? As John Hamilton mentioned earlier, we've been a long-standing investor in the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. Over time, somewhat responsively, we've made impact investments, but we weren't sure we could find enough deal flow. So that was one of the big to-dos for us and an area of exploration. Frankly, we've been pleasantly surprised, and I think there's probably three dimensions or three reasons that I think this has worked better than one might have hoped. First of all, I think consultants have steadily moved in this direction. So the investment consultants have familiarity and expertise, awareness of options that may not be on our radar. The second is that there are more products coming to market generally. And what some people might not think of as impact investments, or they may not have thought of them historically as impact investments because it wasn't really in their lexicon. They prove to be interesting ideas for us. So they're regional development corporations or traditional development finance agencies that actually have some interesting investment opportunities. And so in addition sort of to the market coming to us, there's also a bit of legwork required where I have a colleague I work with. I'm on the investment side. A colleague works on the community impact side. And he spent a fair amount of time sort of just scanning what's happening in New Hampshire, talking to other entities, some of whom haven't historically thought of us as sources of capital for these kinds of investments. And so our portfolio has a mix then of what you might hear about on the traditional investment consultant landscape, as well as what we are hearing about more locally. And so we have very local exposures, and then we have investments that still have some type of New Hampshire exposure, but sometimes it's a sort of second order function of the investment. But that's been an area where we've been pleasantly surprised. We've turned away a number of potential investments as we try to stick to our focus area around what we're trying to achieve with this portfolio.
Great, and talking about focus, maybe we can look at the following slide. And can you walk us through this rationale, how this was developed, and how this influences and filters the investment process?
Many of you may use a bullseye for something or other. We've seen various bullseyes over time. We thought it would be interesting to develop one that was a little more place-based. And frankly, this really reflects how we score potential investments at a very high level. There's a lot more that goes into considering an investment before we're willing to make it. But on the bottom piece of the pie is the traditional, what's the risk-adjusted return for this investment or potential investment? And then we add the social and environmental impact, the intentionality around that. And then finally, as a place-based investor, our interest is in looking at the geographic exposure of that investment. So it may be hard for you to see, but the intent really is to get to the center of the bullseye. And so from a geographic perspective, the optimal investment has New Hampshire exposure and then high social and environmental impact and, the risk-adjusted financial return you'd seek. Just to be clear, for us, we're willing in some cases to take a below-market rate for some investments because we think they're high impact and impacting particularly New Hampshire constituents or communities. The focus of what I would talk about today, though, would tend to be more market rate. And so we've used this as really our rubric for considering at a sort of first pass any potential investment that comes to us to think about what we'll get on that bullseye. There are times where we will invest beyond New Hampshire, or beyond New England. It'll still have most likely some New Hampshire exposure in one form or another, but relatively minor. However, there are trade-offs that investment will provide. So, our portfolio has 11 different investments in it, and it runs the gamut on all of these sort of rings of the pie, but ultimately they cohere into something that hopefully gives us what we seek in terms of New Hampshire impact, the social and environmental impact, and then the return goal that we're seeking.
So with this overlay, could you walk us through how this was applied to CIM and how that complemented some of the other work in the portfolio?
Yep. So as I mentioned, we've been long-standing investors in New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, a CDFI that does tremendous work in our state and has helped also spawn ideas that are born out elsewhere. We're also investors in Boston Community Capital, the Sun Initiative. So we're big believers in CDFIs. There are also populations in this country that are not well served from the traditional financing world. And we heard about community investment management through a couple of sources, one of which is our investment consultants. And we're interested in community investment management's capacity to serve, in effect, identify or serve groups through an area that, frankly, at first gave us some jitters to, online lending and some of the things we've heard about it. So it took us a little while to get comfortable, but community investment management, you guys have been great on pushing responsible lending and ensuring that borrowers are treated fairly and that the lenders to those borrowers are doing the kinds of things you'd expect around transparency and fairness. We also liked the attributes were different in some respects from CDFIs in terms of the investment thesis. The communities served sometimes tend to be different. There's a very good Federal Innovation Roundtable report on sort of contrasting CDFIs and online lenders, which was helpful for our investment committee to get comfortable with the thesis. And then, as with some of our other investments that are national in scope, community investment management can also provide basically half of our investment. The equivalent of that has New Hampshire exposure. So, the reporting you guys do is great. And I don't wish to sound like a shill. I will tout all of the investments that are in our portfolio. I'll also talk about all the negatives. But the reporting to the individual borrower level was useful for our committee in terms of seeing the types of communities served.
Thank you. Maybe on the negatives or disappointments in some of those allocations, any learning lessons or?
Yeah, good question. I heard that question earlier, and I was pondering over that. I mean, we've passed on a number of investments. Our track record's really only for the fund itself since the beginning of 2016. Our long-term track record in terms of going back to 1971, very low default rate when we were more in a lending mode directly to nonprofits. And frankly, we were comfortable sometimes taking on more risk with those investments, so it's inevitable there would be defaults. In terms of the portfolio itself and the underlying investments, it runs the spectrum. There's public equity that's basically going to track the broader markets, but has an interesting community investing lens and also has a geographic tilt to it. We have fixed income that's a national portfolio, but they allocate all the money into New Hampshire. We have some venture capital investments that have a New Hampshire focus to them. The return side has met our goals. The impact side, the venture capital investment was supposed to generate 600 jobs in New Hampshire. It's generated about 450. Maybe you could argue that's a disappointment. We're actually quite pleased because there are other dimensions that we look at the investment from. So far fine. There's bound to be disappointments. Funnily enough, there are disappointments in the traditional investment side, in case you haven't noticed. So we'll just run with it.
And before we open it up to questions, from the conversations you've had today and your experience in the space, any advice for where you see some of our other members here navigating stakeholders, seeking first approvals and allocation processes?
Yes, this is an interesting question. I've been thinking about this because as a community foundation, we have a duty to our community. Our mission is clear. So I would think it's a relatively compelling case that we should be making this kind of investments. And I can understand the struggles for endowments as they think about how to make allocations to impact investing. And so the way it was teed up at the beginning of today's session, that this is around market rate investments. And so as I said, we're comfortable taking below market rate in some instances for high impact. But from an endowment perspective, I can see the interest in going down that route. And then if I was in somebody's shoes on the endowment side, I would ask, once you get past the fiduciary questions and the usual stuff around that, which you can surmount, I think you have to think about your capacity to manage this in-house, to what extent somebody can help you, whether it's your consultant, as Prime Buckholz is doing for University of New Hampshire, a caution around trying to do things directly, and that applies to us as well. We don't have the staff capacity to do a lot of due diligence, to take on a lot of direct deals. We co-invest with the loan fund as well as investing in their general loan pool. But to the extent we can, we find an intermediary who has that capacity to make good decisions around how capital is allocated, and just staying focused on looking for those intermediaries. As I said earlier, there are a lot more products coming to market. If you look at the spectrum of opportunities, you, in many cases, can find good market rate investments for an endowment that will meet impact goals. Now, it depends what they are. If it's more about helping their place, that's one dimension. Of course, there are other dimensions to consider. But I would look for how can you manage the organizational components. For us, board engagement is important, and you clearly see endowments being pushed on this from their student body or from their alumni. And so there's a way that I think making this kind of investing is helpful. But then how you navigate this through an organization, I think, always goes back to the governance side and the challenges that could be associated with that if you can't keep the board or the governing institution with you. And so spending the time to make sure that people have the information they need. And the little reminder I received from when the board said we should go ahead and have a more strategic approach to impact investing than how we've done this historically. And the time we came back to them with the formal recommendation, and then realized that we'd already had about half the board turnover, and so some of them were asking very good and very fundamental questions that I'd hoped we'd left a long time ago. And so realized continuing education, finding the pieces that will make it available and accessible to them. Our board comes from many different backgrounds, so it needs to be, to some extent, customized to the different constituents on the board. If somebody's more community-minded versus an investment person, very successful business people. I think we had two very successful business people say, why would we do this? It's imprudent. And so then we went through a process of saying, well, here's how we think about it. Here's what we think the investments would look like. And then, they were great supporters of it after that.
Great. Well, with that, let's open it up to questions from Michael.
There's a mic here.
Hi there. My name's Laura Berry. I'm representing a private family foundation, but I worked for community foundations in a far less enlightened age. I'm curious about the donor-advised funds. So one of the ostensible benefits of donor-advised funds is that you can influence the grant-making of folks who would really appreciate the community foundation to give them some guidance about local grants. Are you seeing many of your donor-advised funds starting to opt into this? Are you doing any sort of marketing or encouragement of that to grow these funds? And can donors really just sort of say, I want to allocate like 50% of my assets in my donor-advised fund to this? But if that's true, I don't know why every single community foundation isn't doing that. Little editorializing. Anyway, thanks, Michael.
Yeah, okay. So let's break that down in a couple of places. So donor engagement, when we launched the fund, as I mentioned, we'd been nudged by some donors. And so we thought, what a great time to go back to those donors and talk to them about the fund and capitalizing it. And so we did approach a number of donors who we thought might have an alignment or an interest with this type of investing. We did not do a broad push. We have 1,800 funds. We have over 500 donor-advised funds. Most of them are active donor advisors. So what we decided we would do is first conversations with a subset that we think would be aligned with this. And then we've done ongoing marketing, but we haven't done a big push. And frankly, because we think we need more track record. And then as we prove out track record, then I think we can get more comfortable going back to them. So as we built out the portfolio, and now it's, it's robust size in terms of 11 investments. It's not huge, frankly. It's roughly 10 million, but track record then helps us. And if we can make a reasonable return off that, and we can show the type of impact, then I think that's a conversation we can have. You raise a good point. Ultimately, it is the foundation's choice about where assets are allocated. Donors can make a request or recommendation, just as they can with a grant, but it's also the foundation's choice as to whether a grant is made. It's not the donor's choice. So, it's a little bit of that middle ground.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Question here from Alice first, and then we'll go.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
When we were at the Mission Investors Exchange conference, something that struck me that was going on there was that foundations were providing guarantees as a way of taking the risk off of banks making loans that they might perceive as risky. And so since then, I've wondered whether that would work with the university foundation partnership. There's a lot about collaboration there, and I just would like to get your thoughts on maybe the challenges or possibilities. Not necessarily New Hampshire Charitable Foundation doing that, but the potential for that.
Yeah, so we've made guarantees in the past. My colleague on the community impact side, he loved the idea of guarantees. I wasn't as thrilled because there's a fair amount of friction in the system and we have to encumber the assets. So I think, frankly, our challenge is we don't have a ready pool of capital available to act as a guarantee. So if we're guaranteeing $250,000, I need to know where that $250,000 is sitting on our balance sheet to step in. And we don't have a larger pool that we could say, well, we could guarantee X of these. So I know it could be done, but frankly, it felt like a lot of work to do it. So we have done it on occasion. We haven't made it. We haven't made that a strategic priority as far as the impact investing. So I don't want to discount it. I just haven't felt that was the highest and best use of our time for a big push on that. So I don't want to discourage people, but...
Michael, this Bullseye Chart is interesting, and I wondered if you could talk about how this came to be. Was this staff-derived in conjunction with a consultant that you pushed to the board? I mean, part of it is just assessing what the collective value system is in order to move this forward, and I think organizations struggle with that.
So interesting in a good way? My parents are English, and when my mom says something's interesting, it's sort of like... we give her a Christmas present. We say, you never say whether you like it or not. And so she wrote a little sign every time she got a present, said, interesting. So I'll take it that your intent was it's useful. And this is not any great... Really, the genesis of the idea is more about what we've seen broadly. Meyer Memorial Trust out on the West Coast has a lovely bullseye. However, we wanted to tilt it to the geography, so this was staff-driven. But our president and CEO, whenever he speaks to anybody about this, if it's a donor with the first introduction, this is a helpful tool for communicating what we're doing, and I think people find a way to get it here if they haven't got it through the narrative or the stories.
But did you use this to galvanize the board to actually approve the subsector and maybe even move it to the DAF approval process?
Yeah, so good question. This came later. The galvanizing was more through that education, through providing them with hopefully helpful reading and some discussion about what we think that impact would look like.
Right behind you.
Thank you. Hi, as an entrepreneur in the education sector for the past 20 years, I've been now for the past year started making the argument that we desperately need what I call the incubation money, the R&D capital, more the D capital, because I feel like everybody knows where the problems are. But the research available, there's not enough capital to deploy, I would say, entrepreneurs and subject matter experts to go after heavily in a solution that could actually start making it your bullseye more. Do you see a role of the impact dollars coming into what I call the first stage, where we can match a problem with entrepreneurs to go after solving it? Then they could become your pipeline businesses that could draw your high impact and high return.
Right. So if I interpret your question correctly, the way we might think about this is whether grant dollars would be a suitably directed to these types of investments. So one of our lower return investments is with the Nature Conservancy around fisheries permit acquisition for the Gulf of Maine, trying to encourage sustainable fishing to be introduced into the Gulf of Maine. We marry that with grant-making dollars to help, whether it's R&D, as you described, so what are the best sustainable fishing practices? That's not really an investment that's going to return anything from a purely investment perspective, but from the sort of bang for the buck from an R&D perspective, using the grant dollars to support that is useful. Frankly, I don't know how an endowment would navigate that or source the capital. Somebody else would have to talk about that, but at least we're lucky that we can provide that tool of grant-making capital going alongside invested capital where it's warranted. And we do have a number of instances like that. It's like solar installations for nonprofits, where there's clearly an investment thesis that you can pursue on the solar installation, but there are times that those nonprofits need a different type of capital to help them get to the point they need to be, and that would be on the grant-making side. Does that help? Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Really, we have such a...
I always have questions. Someone else should ask me.
We got one where?
Did you raise your hand?
Yes.
Is that a 47 for the years of investment experience?
Yes.
You're going to kill me, aren't you? He needs
I'm
a
old. Could you speak a little more about how you target your equity investments? Because equity and community investment have often been very much on different piles. So I'd like to hear more about how those get integrated.
Yeah, that's a good question. And since you gave me the opportunity, I'll talk about it in terms of where the investment committees spent a little more time on investments. One was community investment management, just trying to get comfortable with the online lending space, as I described. When we look at our portfolio, one of the gaps for a place-based investor is what do you do on the public equity side? For those who visited New Hampshire, you're not going to see many Fortune 500 headquarters as you go up and down 93 or 95. So there's very little activity there, and you wouldn't over-concentrate a portfolio. And so this is where we have probably what one would consider more of like a sustainable investment in the impact investment fund. It's a portfolio, and Ken Lassner from Aperio is here. He's in the back of the room. FB Heron Foundation helped develop a public equity portfolio that has a community investment tilt and a clean energy tilt. Plus, on top of that, you can add a geographic overlay where you can overweight to public equity, to public companies in your region, your geography. Deborah mentioned earlier Encourage Foundation, same kind of portfolio. The idea would be either headquarters or employment. You could get involved in shareholder engagement. So that's on the public side, and it took our committee a little while to get there because the impact is not as high, really, as many of our other investments. However, we needed that return component in the portfolio. And then on the flip side, on the private equity or the private investment side, there are more options there. In our case, we encouraged a venture firm that historically has made a number of local investments to develop a New Hampshire-focused fund. And so I think there are ways you can encourage people on the private investment side to think a little bit more about the place-based component. But that was our solution on the public equity space.